Steph?
Leah,
Jess?
is this line secure?
Hi, everyone. Welcome to Secure Line. I'm Stephanie Carvin.
I'm Leah West.
And I'm Jessica Davis.
I'm so pleased to introduce our guest today, Michelle Tessier. Michelle joined the Canadian Security Intelligence Service in 1988, working at every operational level within the organization, from intelligence officer to senior executive. From December 2018 to March 2023, she was Deputy Director Operations, responsible for the overall management of service operations, intelligence, security screening, and governance. This is generally considered the number 2 position in the organization. And I just want to highlight the fact that prior to her appointment as DDO, she also served as Assistant Director of Collection and Assistant Director of Operations at the service. She was the first woman in all 3 of these executive positions. Michelle, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, and thank you for the invitation.
So we've asked you here to discuss broadly the issues relating to transparency and foreign interference. And I want to be clear, we are recording this on Monday, January 27th, the day before the release of the Hogue Commission report, which I think we should also note that you testified at back in the fall. So we're kind of interested in your views on these topics, of course, before the report comes out. And maybe I can start by asking you your views of the inquiry as a participant.
First of all, I think, obviously, like everybody, very interested to read what the recommendations will be of the commission, because there was a tremendous amount of information that was released to the commission. And frankly, in terms of the classified information, I was actually quite surprised to see the extent of classified information disclosed publicly. But I think that's a good thing. I think given the threat that foreign interference presents to our democratic institutions and the increasing complexity, I think that transparency is good. So I'm quite confident that the commission, notwithstanding the tremendous amount of information they receive, will have interesting observations. Whether or not I ultimately will agree with everything remains to be seen, of course, but I don't doubt that it will be a healthy discussion, and it was a good exercise, if for no other reason than to bring that spotlight on foreign interference.
Yeah, I want to follow up on that a little bit, because one of the things that shaped the conversation around foreign interference in Canada has been media reporting on classified intelligence that's been leaked, on information that's been released at the Commission. And so I wanted to get your impression around how the media has been handling this issue of foreign interference and sort of your perspective on what's good, what's bad, what's ugly.
First of all, I continue to frown on leaks of classified information. That puts at risk human beings. It puts at risk methodologies. It is not often an accurate portrayal of the intelligence. It's bits and pieces, and I think we saw that through some of the media reporting. So it is not something that I think is a good thing. That being said, there has been a lot of discussion of foreign interference, and I think we may have testified to this. Certainly, I've spoken to it about it before. It did get the discussion going because I don't think there was enough discussion on foreign interference. So I don't encourage media leaks. I would encourage that we find other ways to inform the Canadian public. Media leaks is not the way to do it. But if there is anything positive comes out of this, is that discussion and awareness of Canadians on the threat of foreign interference.
So the leaks, the inquiry, you talked about transparency. There was a lot of information disclosed through the public inquiry, which always begs the question, if this information can come out in a public inquiry, why does it take leaks to talk about these things publicly? Why is there not more public engagement on these threats, especially because this is one of those areas, and you may disagree with me or you might agree with me, I suspect you'll agree with me, where public knowledge of the threat really can work to limit its impact. So I guess the question I have is, around this type of threat, how does CSIS balance the need for operational confidentiality with the need to inform the public about the threat and get them engaged and thinking about it? And do you think to this point we've struck the right balance, or the organization has struck the right balance?
Yeah, that's a really, really good and important question. And having spent, it doesn't make me sound so old, but over 3 decades at CSIS, and seeing that evolution of the organization where it is trying to get out there a lot more. And the former director was very keen on giving a lot of speeches, naming countries of concern and that type of thing. And I think when you look at the amount of classified information that was disclosed, that to me is a step in the right direction. Can more be done? Absolutely. But I think that evolution was happening. CSIS went from a very insular organization to opening itself up to its government partners and to the public. And I think that needs to continue to happen. And frankly, one of the reasons that upon retiring that I participate in media interviews and the like was because I personally had a frustration that not enough was getting out there and there wasn't enough understanding of CSIS. Not that I intend on disclosing classified information or anything. I'm still sworn to secrecy for life, but that's not the point. The point is to try to increase awareness in the type of work that's done. The other part of that, though, and I think this came out, at least in my interpretation of the commission, is a willingness for people to accept, receive, understand intelligence. There's still, I've often said that, but there's still a lack of an intelligence culture. There's still what I view as a reluctance to even consider intelligence. And I think that goes with people not really understanding it. The more people understand it and what it's meant for and the context around it, the more willingness people will have in providing feedback and asking questions and in talking about and using intelligence.
I think the idea of intelligence culture is really important, and hopefully we'll touch on it again. But one of the things I think that has come up in this conversation around the inquiry, and I won't get into the specifics because I worked for it, just in general with the rise and the understanding and acceptance of this idea of misinformation, is looking to our intelligence agencies as almost an arbiter of truth, as the intelligence agencies are supposed to be the one telling us what is true and what is not true. That's a very different role for intelligence agencies, communicating to the public what is true and not true. And this is even one of the roles of the intelligence agencies and the Security to Elections Task Force potentially would be to publicly pronounce about when they see foreign interference in the form of disinformation. So I'm wondering if you've given any thought to whether this is the right role for intelligence agencies. If it's not, who should be doing it, and how, as a senior leader in that world, you're wrestling with this.
I actually suspect that how the service presents its intelligence may come up in some of the findings of the commission in terms of tailoring in a better way intelligence to readership. I don't know, obviously, at this stage if it will, but I wouldn't be surprised that there's a comment to that effect in helping readers understand intelligence. And I think in today's day and age where there's a 24/7 news cycle, everybody's now a journalist, everybody's got their camera. Some of the greatest frustration working for an intelligence service is something happens in the news and people want the answers right now, immediately, when we don't even know what's going on, let alone being able to analyze it. So it's that balance between how do you, frankly, compete with what's out there. You mentioned misinformation and the importance of getting accurate information out there quickly, because people will turn to whatever source of information they have available. And if it turns out to be false down the road, that's very difficult to pull back. So as an intelligence service, it is tailoring your intelligence in a way that you can send stuff out quickly that may or may not be fully assessed with proper caveats, but being able to follow that up. And one thing I've noticed in Canada is there is a bit of a reluctance in government writ large, not just in the service, to send out blurbs of information saying, this is what we think, but we'll get back to you once we have further assessment. There seems to be this search for, let's get the whole picture before we communicate. And I think the service is a victim of that because, of course, it speaks to credibility. Don't want to alarm Canadians and the like. But I do think there needs to be a way to, at the very least, say, this is what we see. We're on it. We'll get back to you, and then keep that wheel of communication going. So modernizing the use of intelligence, finding the tools to do so is going to be a must. Otherwise, people don't have time to read 120 pages of an analysis. They're going to turn elsewhere for their sources of information, which can be a very scary thought, honestly, given what's out there. So there has to be a way to ensure that your intelligence is being read and that people are looking towards it. Even if it's, look, we think this is what happened, we'll get back to you, and then keep updated as opposed to waiting to have the full picture, as an example.
So we've kind of talked around the context around the issue of foreign interference, right? And the inquiry and the issues regarding transparency, media reporting, all these different kinds of things. I'm wondering if you could take us back. As you said, you spent several decades at the service in all aspects of its operations and collection. How did we get into this situation? Can you explain foreign interference. What are some of the tactics that we have seen foreign states use to influence our institution? How have we gotten into this mess in the first place?
Foreign interference has been part of the CSIS Act since its creation, which says something. It's called foreign influence activities, as you know, in the Act, but it has been there since its creation, and CSIS has been investigating it since its creation. I would say that there is so much political sensitivity around foreign interference, and CSIS would have been aware of that sensitivity and would have been careful how it does its investigations. I think it's just an evolution that occurred over time. Frankly, probably more recently than it should have. It's been there. Was it considered as much of a priority as it could have been? That can be debated. CSIS has been looking at it since it was created. It certainly took on a heightened importance, certainly publicly, with the first Trump election in 2016, and then the French elections and Brexit and all that, where there was talk of foreign interference. But it isn't anything new, and CSIS was communicating it. But I would say that in terms of being able to talk about it, given the sensitivities, it's the most sensitive aspects of a democracy. I think there was maybe a bit of a reluctance to even go there, given what we're talking about, political parties, elections. You don't want your intelligence service meddling about in elections and, any perception to that effect. But it has been in the CSIS Act since CSIS creation. So it is something that was recognized, just not really dealt with, obviously, as openly as it should have been. And I think all the work that was done back in 2017, 2018, 2019 to set up bodies within government to deal with this was quite something, because I think elections are always seen as, don't touch. I mean, this is very sensitive. It has to be done a certain way. Obviously, it's the most important in terms of our democracy. But it's not just federal politics. And I think that's where that discussion needs to continue in terms of foreign interference. A lot of focus has been on the federal level, but it's at all levels of government. And I think that's where a lot of the work still needs to be done.
And I think we can also trace back the conversation around foreign interference also to the Harper government and his statements around the Investment Canada Act and acquisitions of Canadian companies by foreign actors. Because that was, I think, to my recollection, and you should correct me if I'm wrong, that to me was the first time that a Canadian Prime Minister really started pointing the finger and saying things out loud about particular problematic activities.
Yes,
Plus that whole
absolutely.
intervention by Dick Fadden in 2020, I think it was, that got him into trouble.
Yes, I was actually going to mention that as well, saying, Director Fadden at the time was pretty explicit, and it didn't go over very well.
And just to be clear to our audience, this was when Dick Fadden, I think he did 2 media interviews where he suggested that there were Canadian officials who were basically being influenced by China. It kind of came out of nowhere, like without any context. There was a House of Commons committee that was set up to investigate his comments and kind of dragged him over the coals. What was interesting is that the first NCCOP, the first National Security Intelligence Committee of Parliamentarians report, came out and said, no, he was right. This is actually a thing that's happening. So just for some context to our listeners.
Yeah, and that's a really important comment on the NCCOP, to use their abbreviation, on their initial report on that. And even back then, the importance of briefing all parliamentarians as an example. And I think for this service, a lot of times, not just foreign interference, but foreign interference being one of them, certainly an important one, it's, what's the word I'm looking for? I want to say comforting, but it's so important to have other stakeholders speak up. You mentioned the Prime Minister as an example at the time, investments into Canada, and to have government, whichever government that happens to be in power, stand up and acknowledge a threat is really important. And other countries, and whether or not CSIS itself is considering doing this, I don't know. But I know Australia and the UK, their directors invite the media and stakeholders over, and they give a threat overview of quite an open one. And I think that's, whether or not the service is considering that, I don't know. But, that's the part of an important communication tool to the public. I think when politicians themselves, especially when the government themselves acknowledge the risk, that goes a long way. And there could have been political sensitivities in the past. I can't really speak to, well, there obviously were, because of the trouble, or at least the negative feedback that Director Fadden received at the time, that to have other key members of government, including other deputy ministers, including other government departments, speak up a bit more, I think would add a lot of credibility to what is coming out in the intelligence world.
So if I could just then do a follow-up, because we've spoken a lot of foreign interference. I really feel that it didn't get attention in this country until it started attacking, or it became known that it was attacking politicians, right? And our political institutions. But in reality, as you mentioned, this has been on the CSIS to-do list since 1984. It has predominantly impacted communities, like new Canadians are diverse communities within the country. Can you speak to that? Because on the one hand, I think these communities don't want to become communities of surveillance, right? They don't want to like just have CSIS are being interfered with. Are you being interfered with? But on the other hand, they're also saying, hey, we are being interfered with. Help us. And they're not necessarily finding one place to go to. There doesn't really seem to be a lot of help for those who are looking for it. So can you maybe speak to the more transnational repression side of this?
I think what it also speaks to is how this needs to be a multi-stakeholder issue. It can't just be the intelligence service. One of the most disturbing parts of or threats from foreign interference is, as you point out, the transnational repression issue, where communities are being targeted, communities who may have moved here to get away from authoritarian governments only to find themselves being still targeted or threatened or have their family back home threatened. There is no way an intelligence service can do its work if it doesn't have the support of a community. And if it's a community and people living in Canada don't feel that they're being protected, it is a huge concern. It is a huge concern when they may feel that they don't know, as you point out, who to turn to. I am hopeful that the new legislation that came out, I guess, summer of 2024 now, changes to the criminal code, tools that make agencies being able to actually do something. You see a lot of charges, as an example, in the United States. I think there would be greater comfort if we saw more enforcement action in Canada, but agencies need to have the tools. They need to have the legislation to allow them to lay charges that are cited in the criminal code. I know CSIS takes a huge role with communities and is constantly speaking with communities, but there has to be a multi-stakeholder effort when we're looking at foreign interference. CSIS does not have enforcement powers. They work with other government departments and they share that information with other government departments. But even beyond government, I think, again, tools that would be given to the service to increase the number of stakeholders they can share classified information with so that people feel that they're equipped to act. If they don't know what the information is, it makes it very difficult to take action, to develop policies, to educate people. CSIS has been doing threat reduction measures and finding other creative ways to get information to key stakeholders. But obviously, that's not always the best way and the simplest way and the most efficient way. Hopefully, with the recommendations that may come up from the inquiry, that will equip the agencies and other key stakeholders to actually be able to share information and take action.
Yeah, so I'm just going to jump in and explain to the audience, and Michelle, maybe you could provide some practical background or examples on this. Up until 2024, CSIS was only permitted to share information it gathered through its activities with other federal departments or with law enforcement agencies. The exemptions that you cannot share, and then it allowed for exceptions in those instances. But there was consistently this outcry from other stakeholders saying, you need to give us more information so that we can understand the threat. And CSIS was stymied by the act. There were some mechanisms employed, and Michelle just mentioned threat reduction measures. And threat reduction measures are a tool that was introduced in 2015, again, relatively new, not really put into place until reformed at C-59, which passed in 2019, and allowed CSIS to share information outside law enforcement or the federal government if it could reasonably be believed to reduce a threat to the security of Canada. So in the context, we're talking about foreign interference. So now there are new allowances for the sharing of information. You can share non-personal information if it'll make the stakeholder that's receiving that information more resilient. And you can even potentially share with the director's approval personal information when it's necessary. It's a higher threshold. We heard a lot over the years about how this lack of ability to share information, particularly when you were dealing with diaspora communities, was a hindrance, but maybe you could put a little bit more context on that, Michelle.
Sure. CSIS has been able to share certainly with law enforcement partners, as was cited, some of its information. Part of the difficulty is then using that information as evidence in court. And I'm sure you can probably speak to this better than me, but
It's called intelligence to evidence,
yes.
and we haven't reinstated the drinking game from past podcasts, but we might have to.
And it's, I'm asked a lot when we look at all the tools that have been introduced, what is the biggest remaining gap, in my opinion? And in my opinion, it's intelligence to evidence, because the new national security law does not.
And I get an amen. Thank you.
You look at the UK, like, I know countries around the world have different legal systems. I get that. But ours is not identical, granted, but it's pretty close. And, same parliamentary system, they're able to do it. They're able to do it because they can still protect some of that information, the sources of that information. And that's the big issue, is not putting at risk. I was referring to this earlier with media leaks. Well, it also applies in an open court system where you don't want to put at risk methodologies and sources of information. So that's what makes it challenging. It has happened. It is happening increasingly, that working closely with primarily, not uniquely, but primarily the RCMP and the Prosecution Service of Canada, that developing ways to declassify and then eventually share that information. Very onerous. Not necessarily always all that, frankly, helpful to a case if they have to go through this laborious system. So I think that's my one priority, I would say, if I was able to wave a magic wand and make this happen.
Yeah, I just want to foot stomp that as someone who's spent a lot of their academic work looking at this issue, is that it's one thing to give law enforcement new criminal enforcement powers, but when those offenses are predominantly, or could conceivably in large part stem from intelligence investigations, if you don't fix the intelligence to evidence piece, giving law enforcement new powers isn't necessarily going to solve the problem of being able to successfully prosecute foreign interference offenses.
I just want to quickly follow up on that. And this is for both Leah and Michelle. I would like to get both of your thoughts on this. So are you saying that One Vision has not solved all of these problems?
I would just say, and can you explain what One Vision is?
Yeah, because there was a recent NSI COP report, I think, that said that One Vision 3.0 had a lot of promise. And I've heard some folks basically say, well, that's fixed it, and we're not going to proceed with any further reforms. So I'm just curious as to what both of your perspectives are on that, actually.
Sure, maybe I'll start. It has create improvements in the understanding, I would say, of the agency's mandates, both like the RCMP and the service. So what One Vision is a framework to allow the RCMP and the service, primarily the service, to share information with the RCMP in such a way that enables the RCMP to look at the information, determine whether or not they can or want to use it in a criminal investigation. But at least senior management of the RCMP being aware of what the information is, but keeping it away from the field investigators so it doesn't interfere with their investigative work. But it is a way to bring awareness to senior levels of the RCMP. Here are some issues of concern. And then they try to work together to determine what can be shared, what would be helpful to the RCMP. So it's improved in the relationship. And then Public Prosecution of Canada is also part of that discussion sometimes. So it's improved in the understanding of the willingness of the organizations to work together. But I've always said, and it speaks to what Leah just said, I couldn't agree more. Why is it the organizations trying to figure this out? They want this to work. They obviously want strong relationships, but really they're working within a system. They're trying to find the best way they can with a system that doesn't really allow them to work as closely as they would like to in an efficient manner. So it's not through lack of willingness. I would say there's been a lot of improvement. The relationships are quite strong across the country and in the headquarters. But it is something that I think there needs to also be legislative protections that would make the work a bit easier for both agencies, in my view.
Yeah, I think One Vision did a good job of solving a lot of the problems with intelligence to evidence that were first raised way back with the Air India inquiry, I would say, where it was really this lack of any working relationship and a lack of trust between organizations that prevented good intelligence sharing that might have had an impact on both the act itself and mostly the prosecution. The actual act of using information collected from intelligence in a criminal proceeding, not fixed. right? Nothing has been fixed in that regard. The best coordination ever doesn't change the fact that sometimes you need to use information directly from an intelligence agency in a criminal investigation. And the best example of this is the Wang case recently, where a CSIS wiretap reading between the lines of a Chinese embassy was the fruit of an investigation of someone trying to sell secrets to China. You can't get around that with a good working relationship. And that prosecution crumbled. So I think Michelle's totally right. It's greasing the skids of a clunky system is what One Vision is, and making it work as best as possible for the two agencies that need to work within it, or three if you include PPSC. But you could actually rebuild the system to make it a lot smoother to prosecute national security offenses.
So we're facing at least 2 elections this year, one provincially and certainly one federally. How should we be preparing for them from a foreign interference perspective? Like, what lessons have we learned and what things need to be implemented to make those elections resilient against foreign interference?
The timing, obviously, of the Hogue Commission report will be very important for preparing for those elections. Of course, the focus of the commission, as I mentioned, was on the federal level, but provincially, obviously, it's key as well. Again, the new legislation that was introduced last summer, in theory anyways, should allow CSIS to brief provincial party leaders, provincial deputies, which it couldn't share classified information before. How? I'm not aware of the mechanisms now that CSIS will be looking at for that, but at least now they're able to deal directly with the province, which before they could certainly speak to the province, but without getting into those details. So that should help. But I would like to think that, and we already have seen it, I was about to say, we would like to think that the political parties themselves are looking at this issue and putting in place whatever measures they feel is appropriate to protect themselves. I think you saw some of that with the Liberal leadership run, where they made some tweaks in terms of who could actually vote for the Liberal leader. And I think that is an indication that, I would like to think anyways, that's an indication that the politicians themselves, the parties themselves, are very aware that they will be looked at and likely scrutinized in terms of the measures they're putting into place. And I think ongoing discussion about this whole issue continues to be important. It's not like, okay, we've done it now, let's move on and forget it ever happened. I mean, shining the light on this type of activity is hugely important. Frankly, you're never going to get rid of it. You're never going to get rid of hostile states or foreign states of any ilk trying to interfere for their own interests. I'm often asked, well, what's the difference between a foreign interference threat and normal diplomacy? And CSIS has come up with a structure that identifies what's a threat. First of all, it has to come from a foreign state. Foreign state has to be involved. It has to be deceptive or clandestine or involve a threat. And to me, the key element is it has to be against Canada's national interests. So of course, states are trying to get their policies supported by foreign countries. Canada does the same thing. But when it's deceptive, clandestine, or involves a threat, we talk about transnational repression. When it's really trying to restrict Canada's national interests or overturn Canada's national interests, that's where it becomes a huge concern. So I think what's going to be really important is to continue to have this discussion and not just have a commission, sort of look at it, sweep it under the rug, and then move on. I think it's really important as this threat gets increasingly complex. I'm personally very concerned about disinformation out there and the complexity of states being able to create disinformation, people believing that disinformation. And how do you get through that? And the only way you can get through that is by increased transparency, by having examples that you can discuss and look towards and hopefully prevent. I think that's what's going to be the struggle, frankly, going on, is keeping that discussion alive and people seeing action, or at least hearing about action concerning the protection of our democratic institutions.
Michelle, we're getting to the end of our conversation. So I do want to ask you a couple of questions. I mean, we have heard a lot in recent years of criticism at the service, particularly on issues of discrimination, harassment, some really difficult cases. You, as I mentioned in the beginning of the intro to this podcast, have been there as a woman in some of the most important roles. Can you talk about that experience at the service, being in that position, working in the service as a woman, maybe how things have changed in recent years, including as the service itself has come under the spotlight for some of the HR issues that have been there?
One of my roles in the service was being Director General of our security branch. And I was often asked, what issues do you see from a security perspective, especially personnel security? And I would say, well, you see society, because the service is composed of human beings. And so what you see in society, you see in the service. Yes, of course, there's security cleared and all of this, but life happens and you deal with issues that people face, unfortunately, some difficult issues. And the service is not immune from that. But certainly over the decades I was at the service, there was an evolution for sure. I mean, there were difficult, even as a woman starting out in the service, I did receive the typical, oh, you only got that job because you're a woman. Actually, the person who said that to me actually subsequently apologized. That being said, I was quite supported by my colleagues and by my management throughout my career. And I often messaged that it was that support that helped me along throughout my career. Yes, the service has to make improvements. There were inappropriate comments made, and probably still are, like there are in all organizations. It was most definitely a male-dominated environment when I started. It was formed from the RCMP, so there was sort of a military mindset to it, very hierarchical. But frankly, that is not accepted today by employees. The hierarchy that I grew up in, where you wouldn't even dream of walking into a manager's office, I mean, that is all gone. There is an expectation of engagement. So you can't have an efficient organization and a happy organization if you don't evolve with the times. So CSIS has made efforts to do that. Is it perfect? Absolutely not. It takes time to change a culture. A lot of effort has gone into the diversity, equity, and inclusion campaigns. I was the diversity champion when I retired. Just discussing those issues was so important. Having listening sessions, creating support networks. So a lot of that effort went into it. Changing a culture doesn't happen overnight. I think it's moving in the right direction, but undoubtedly still has a lot of work to do. But, I look around and I would say the intelligence world is still very much a male-dominated environment. I'm going to go out on a limb here, but you look at the directors of the Five Eyes, and other than Carolyn Xavier, maybe a few others, you're still having men, frankly, white men at the helm of these organizations. CSIS has never had a woman director other than the brief period of interim director when Vanessa was interim director. So nothing against the current director of CSIS at all. He's a very well-suited for that position, a very well-respected individual. I know him well. So it's nothing against him or others at all. They're all very competent, dedicated individuals. But I do think there are missed opportunities in the intelligence world, especially the human intelligence world. CSC has done a much better job than CSIS has. CSIS, to me, was a lost opportunity. Again, all the respect I have for Dan Rogers, but I think the fact there's never been a woman, let alone a member of a visible minority, leading intelligence in a country like Canada is unacceptable, frankly.
I think we can agree that, we can appreciate the skills of the people who are there while at the same time acknowledging representation matters.
Yes. And, as a human and primarily a human intelligence service, you need to work with the community. You need to work with the communities in Canada. Certainly, the service has made great efforts in creating a diverse workforce because people want to see people, as they often say, who are like me. Like I enjoyed working for female managers, but that needs to move as well to senior leadership positions as well. And I think that's where more work needs to be done. In terms of women, a lot has been done. And at one point, I think the majority of senior leaders in CSIS were women. But again, it's a lot of the visibility that goes with that. And to me, the role of the director of CSIS and other intelligence agencies is key. They're the public senior face and the face towards all employees. So anyhow, I think that's where they have some work to do.
So one last question for you. Wondering if you could share your thoughts on how you see the new Trump administration impacting national security in Canada, in particular, those relationships amongst the Five Eyes and the direct relationships between Canada, the United States, and the intelligence community.
I think, like all commentators are saying, that second Trump administration is likely going to be different than the first one because he has had the experience of governing and knows how the system works. And so certainly during the first Trump administration, nothing changed. Those relationships are really, really solid. The partnerships were strong and continue to be strong. I've got a lot of confidence that that will continue, certainly at the working level. But intelligence is so important. Security is so important that I don't think any government will want to put at risk their own national security. And the way you ensure you have a strong national security is by building those relationships. I think, notwithstanding a lot of the public comments and the debates and some of the individuals who are being cited as potentially working in the intelligence community, I think when reality happens, those relationships will continue. They're very, very solid. Sure, you may have some political grandstanding at some point, but I actually don't think that on a daily basis, it's really going to affect the relationships because it's what every country holds dearest. And there's that realization that you have to be able to share information. Otherwise, you're putting yourself at risk. And I certainly don't expect the US to do that. I think there'll be, like anything, a transition, especially as the new directors come aboard. But I do think that throughout those organizations, those relationships will continue to be quite strong.
Michelle, I can't thank you enough for coming on and sharing your thoughts about foreign interference, about working at the service, about Donald Trump, of all things, with us today. I know we appreciate it. We know our listeners will appreciate it. Thank you for this very good conversation, and hopefully it'll be the first of many.
Thank you. Thanks for the invitation. It's such an important topic that I'm glad that we're talking about it. So thank you again.
Cheers. That concludes another episode of Secure Line. We're really happy you could join us today. If you can, it would really help us if you could spread the word, if you enjoyed the content. You can rate us on all the podcast apps that are out there and, just spread the word. Thanks.
Thank you.